Welcome to Life Rebounding. I want to look today at the first verse of Ephesians chapter 1 in the New Testament of the Bible. Paul is writing a letter to the Ephesian believers, and he begins with this opening salutation. He says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God. Now, pausing there, we need to step back a little bit from that salutation and just do a little recollecting of the identity of Paul himself. Paul wasn't always known as Paul. He began his life as Saul. And Saul was somebody who was well steeped, well groomed, well educated in the ways of the Pharisees. He was a rising star, as it were, in terms of Pharisaical life. He was the coat rack that the Pharisees laid their clothes on when they stoned Stephen. And he was such a rising star with them that he was given letters of authority to go and throw into jail anybody that was a follower of Jesus. He became known as a persecutor of Christians until that fateful day when, as he was on his way to Damascus, he met Jesus in a vision. And that transformed his life from that point forward. And he began to see himself in a very different way. Now, previously, he described himself as a Pharisee of Pharisees. But after that, he would describe himself more in relationship to more by his relationship to Jesus Christ. And so when he talks about being an apostle by the will of God, he's identifying himself by way of his relationship to Christ and what Christ has done for him and what Christ has called him to do. There are two things that help shape our identity: relationships and tasks. And Jesus Christ gives us both of those things by way of relationship with him, and then he invites us to join him in what he's doing, so that there are always tasks for us in terms of fulfilling the will of God in our lives and for the church. And so Paul very much was a part of that. He says he's called by the will of God to be an apostle. That becomes an identifier for him. His birthright, his training, and his passion were part of who he was, but it wasn't until his life was intersected by Jesus Christ that it began to take on an integrated whole. And that's what we begin to see in these descriptions that he gives us in Ephesians chapter 1. By self-admission, Paul says this. He says that whatever was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What's more, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I've lost all things. I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ. Jesus put in Paul all that he would need for his life of service. And that's really the point that I want to try and make here, is that God has indeed put everything in you that you need to be his servant, to be a blessing to others. You were qualified before you were called. God put all of that into you. And that's part of the beauty of this, is that it shifts the focus of our identity off of ourselves and what we bring to what Jesus Christ brings. And so when you hear today that you were called before you're qualified, hear that God has had some intentionality in his love for you and his desire for you to be a part of what he's doing in this world today. Well, may you grow in your depth of love for him, and I pray that knowing that you were qualified before you were called may encourage you in your walk of faith.